On Mother's Day, my son's wife looked me dead in the eye in front of the entire dinner party and said, "Moms who abandon their kids don't deserve to be called moms." Right after she threw the handmade quilt I had stitched with so much love onto the floor like it was trash, the entire room froze. My son Zachary dropped his fork with a loud clatter. My granddaughter Lorinda shrank down in her chair, terrified to look up. The wealthy guests from the country club stopped their conversations mid-sentence. Even the catering staff, standing in the doorway, went still, sensing that something unforgivable had just been said. I sat there paralyzed, staring at the gift lying in a crumpled heap next to her sharp high heels. I had spent 6 months making it, hoping it would finally bring us together. But I didn't know that this moment would expose a family secret that would change everything. Now, let me tell you how it happened. It was raining in Seattle that afternoon, that steady, gray drizzle that we are known for up here in the Pacific Northwest. But inside my dining room, the air felt heavier than any storm cloud outside. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and the tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife? That is exactly how it felt at my own dining table on Mother's Day. I had spent 2 days preparing the meal. I made the pot roast Zachary used to love when he was a boy, the one with the extra carrots, and the thick gravy. I made the scalloped potatoes that take 3 hours to get just right. I wanted everything to be perfect, but as I looked around the table, all I saw were eyes looking down at their plates or checking their phones. My son, Zachary, sat at the head of the table. He looked tired. He's a good man, or at least he used to be, but lately he looks like a man walking on eggshells in his own life. Beside him sat his wife, Augustina. She was picking at the roast beef like it was poison. She hadn't said more than 2 words to me since they arrived, and when she did speak, it was usually a complaint disguised as a question. "Is there a lot of salt in this, Nanette?" she had asked earlier. "We're trying to watch our sodium. For our health." I just smiled and told her it was the same recipe I had used for 40 years. I tried to keep the peace. I always try to keep the peace. I didn't want to ruin the day. I had been waiting for this moment for weeks because I had something special to give them. My granddaughter, Lorinda, was sitting quietly next to her mother. She is 10 years old now, with big, watchful eyes. She looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. I gave her a wink when I poured her water, but she barely smiled back. It broke my heart a little. A 10-year-old girl should be full of life, not looking like she's afraid to make a sound. Once the plates were cleared, I couldn't wait any longer. My heart started beating a little faster in my chest. I reached under the buffet table and pulled out the large gift box I had wrapped in soft lavender paper. "I have a little something," I said, my voice trembling just a bit. "For the house. For all of you." Zachary looked up and managed a small smile. "Mom, you didn't have to get us anything. It's Mother's Day. We're supposed to be celebrating you." "Oh, hush," I said, waving him off. "A mother never stops being a mother. Go on. Open it." I slid the box toward Augustina. I wanted her to see it first. I wanted to bridge that gap between us. I thought, maybe if she sees how much time I put into this, she will understand how much I love them. Augustina sighed. A long, loud exhale through her nose, like opening a gift, was a terrible chore. She ripped the paper off without caring and lifted the lid. Inside lay the quilt. I had spent the last 6 months working on it. Every evening, after I finished my chores, I sat in my armchair and stitched. It wasn't just any blanket. It was a memory quilt. I had embroidered vibrant floral patterns, vines twisting around the edges, and right in the center, I had stitched Lorinda's initials in a soft, golden thread. It was thick, warm, and made to last a lifetime. Augustina pulled it out with 2 fingers, holding it away from her body like it was a dirty rag. "A blanket," she said flatly. It's a quilt, I corrected gently. I made it by hand. Look, Augustina, I put Lorinda's initials in the center. I thought you could keep it on the sofa in the den for when it gets chilly. Augustina let the quilt drop back into the box in a crumpled heap. She wiped her hands on her napkin as if the fabric had been covered in dust. Nanette, look at this house, she said, gesturing around my dining room, then pointing to her own designer purse on the floor. Our home is modern. We have a minimalist aesthetic. We don't do country crafts. It looks cheap. The word hung in the air. Cheap. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. It's not cheap, Augustina. The materials cost me a fair bit, but the time, I put hundreds of hours into that. Time isn't value, Nanette, she snapped. This is just clutter. Honestly, I don't know why you bother. You always try to force these sentimental things on us, trying to act like the perfect doting grandmother now. I am a doting grandmother, I said, my voice hardening. I looked at Zachary, waiting for him to tell her to stop, waiting for him to say, Augustina, that's enough. Mom worked hard on this. But Zachary just stared at his water glass. He didn't say a word. Augustina let out a cold, sharp laugh. Please, you think because you sew a blanket now, it makes up for the past? You think we don't remember? Remember what? I asked, confused. I've always been here for you. Augustina leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Oh, really? Were you? Because the way Zachary tells it, you were never home. You were always at that factory, always working, always too tired to be a real mother. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I was a widow at 35, I said, my voice shaking. I worked double shifts so Zachary could eat, so he could have clothes on his back. I didn't have a choice. You always had a choice, Augustina spat back. You chose the money. You chose to leave your son alone in this house for hours on end while you chased a paycheck. You neglected him. She stood up then, towering over the table, looking down at me with pure disgust. She pointed a manicured finger right in my face. You can play the sweet old lady act for your church friends, Nanette. But we know the truth. Moms who abandon their kids don't deserve to be called moms. The room went deathly silent. The words hit me like a physical slap across the face. Abandon. I sat there, frozen. I looked at Lorinda. The poor girl was staring at her plate, tears welling in her eyes. Then I looked at my son, my Zachary, the boy I had raised on my own, the boy I had scrubbed floors for, the boy I had come home to every night, no matter how my back ached, to make sure his homework was done. Zachary. I whispered. I needed him to look at me. I needed him to tell her she was wrong. I needed him to say, my mother sacrificed everything for me. Zachary dropped his fork onto his plate with a loud clatter. He looked up, his face red, his eyes full of conflict. He looked at his wife, angry and dominant, and then he looked at me, and he said nothing. He looked back down at the table. That silence hurt more than anything Augustina had said. Her words were cruel, but his silence was a betrayal. It told me that he had listened to her poison for so long that he had started to believe it. He was letting her rewrite our history. He was letting her turn my sacrifice into a sin. Augustina smirked, seeing his submission. She sat back down and took a sip of her wine, looking satisfied, as if she had just won a game. Take the quilt to the Goodwill, Nanette, she said casually. Maybe some poor family can use it. It doesn't belong with us. I looked at the quilt, crumpled in the box. I looked at the son, who wouldn't meet my eyes. And for the first time in years, the sadness in my heart didn't turn into tears. It turned into something else. It turned into a cold, hard resolve. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply reached out, closed the lid of the box, and placed my hands on top of it. You are right, Augustina, I said softly, my voice steady and clear in the silent room. This quilt holds a lot of memories. It holds a lot of truth. And truth is something this table is sorely lacking. I saw a flicker of confusion cross her face. She expected me to break. She expected me to beg for forgiveness for a crime I didn't commit. But I wasn't going to beg. Not today. Because while she was busy shouting about abandonment, I was looking at my granddaughter, and I noticed something I should have seen earlier. Lorinda wasn't just quiet. She was terrified, and that terror looked hauntingly familiar. I wasn't the one who had abandoned my child, but looking at the woman sipping wine across from me, I was starting to suspect who really had. Most women would have grabbed their purse and run out the door in tears. I know that is what Augustina wanted me to do. She wanted to shame me out of my own son's house. She wanted to erase me from the picture, so she could go back to pretending her perfect life didn't have any cracks in it. But I didn't move. I looked at the quilt box. Then I looked at my empty plate, and I slowly pulled my chair closer to the table. I picked up my fork. The metal felt cold and heavy in my hand. I wasn't hungry, not in the slightest, but I refused to let her see me bleed. If I left now, I was admitting guilt. If I left now, I was agreeing with her lie. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and thick. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the sound of rain tapping against the expensive glass windows. Augustina let out a loud, irritated sigh, realizing I wasn't fleeing the scene. She reached for a wet wipe from her purse and started aggressively scrubbing the table where the quilt box had rested moments before. Honestly, Zachary, she said, her voice high and tight, you really need to talk to your mother about boundaries and hygiene. Did you see the dust coming off that thing? It's probably full of mites. I can't have that kind of filth around Lorinda. Her allergies are sensitive. Dust. She was worried about a few microscopic specks of lint from clean cotton batting. I watched her manicured hand scrubbing the polished wood, and suddenly the dining room faded away. The smell of her expensive roast beef disappeared, replaced by the smell of machine oil and stale air. My mind went back 35 years, back to the day my husband, Dave, died of a heart attack right at the dinner table. He was 36. I was 35. We had $200 in savings and a mortgage that wasn't even close to being paid off. Zachary was just a little boy then, with knobby knees and eyes that looked too big for his face. Augustina talks about abandonment. She throws that word around like it's a weapon. She doesn't know what the word means. Abandonment is standing at a gravesite with a 7-year-old boy holding your hand, knowing that when you go home, the lights might get turned off because the main breadwinner is in the ground. I remembered the factory. It was a cannery on the edge of town. It doesn't exist anymore. They tore it down to build condos like the one Augustina grew up in. But I remember it. I remember the noise. It was so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. The air was thick with dust, not the soft lint from a quilt, but heavy, gritty dust from cardboard boxes and machinery. I worked the line. 8 hours a day wasn't enough to pay the bills, so I took the double shifts. I worked 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. My hands, the same hands that stitched that quilt, used to be raw and cracked. I would come home smelling like metal and sweat. I would scrub my skin with harsh soap until it burned, just so I wouldn't smell like the factory when I tucked Zachary into bed. It's irresponsible, Augustina continued, snapping me back to the present. She tossed the dirty wet wipe onto her plate. Parents today know better. You have to be present. You have to be there emotionally. You can't just warehouse your children while you go off to find yourself. Find myself, I thought. I almost laughed out loud. I didn't go to that factory to find myself. I didn't leave my 7-year-old son with a key around his neck and a list of emergency numbers because I wanted a career. I did it because I was terrified. Every morning, I had to look Zachary in the eye and tell him, lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone, not even if they say they know me. Make yourself a sandwich. Watch TV. I will be home as soon as I can. I died 1,000 deaths every day I walked out that door. I worried about fire. I worried about burglars. I worried he would choke on a piece of bread and no one would be there to help him. The guilt ate me alive. It was a heavy stone I carried in my chest every single shift. But I carried it. Why? Because the alternative was losing our home. The alternative was seeing my son hungry. I looked at Zachary across the table. He was staring at his wine glass, swirling the red liquid around and around. Does he remember? Does he remember the Christmas I worked 3 weeks of overtime without a day off? I did it to buy him that bicycle he wanted, the red one. I was so tired on Christmas morning, I fell asleep sitting up on the couch while he unwrapped it. I missed seeing his face when he opened the box because I physically couldn't keep my eyes open. Augustina calls that neglect. I called it love. We just have different values. Augustina said, looking at her friends around the table for validation. My parents were always there. My mother never worked a day in her life. She greeted me at the door with cookies every day after school. That's what a child needs. Stability, not a mother who prioritizes a paycheck over her own flesh and blood. That was it. The contrast was so sharp it cut me. Augustina sat there in her silk blouse with her soft hands that had never scrubbed a floor, never packed a box, never panicked about an electric bill. She came from money. She married money. She had never known the sheer, paralyzing terror of being the only thing standing between her child and the street. She viewed my survival as a character flaw. She viewed my sacrifice as a sin. I looked at Lorinda again. The little girl was pushing peas around her plate, looking miserable. Augustina talked a big game about being present, but she had spent the entire dinner looking at her reflection in the window or checking her phone. I realized then that Augustina wasn't just cruel, she was ignorant. And ignorance is a dangerous thing when it's holding a microphone. I finally cleared my throat. The sound was small, but in that silent room, it sounded like a gavel hitting a desk. I placed my fork down gently. I sat up straight, squaring my shoulders. My back hurt, the same way it used to hurt after a long shift, but I ignored it. You talk a lot about things you have read in books, Augustina, I said. My voice was low, but steady. I looked her right in the eyes. She blinked, surprised that I was speaking again. Excuse me? You talk about dust, I said, and you talk about abandonment, but you are confusing necessity with neglect. I am simply stating facts, she sniffed. Zachary told me he was a latchkey kid. That is a trauma response. He had a key, I said firmly, because I was a widow. There was no insurance, money, Augustina. There was no trust fund for my parents. There was just me and the factory and a stack of bills on the kitchen counter. I saw Zachary flinch. Good. He should flinch. I miss school plays because if I didn't work that shift, we didn't have heat for the winter. I continued. I miss soccer games because that overtime paid for his dental work. You sit there with your manicures and your judgment, and you dare to tell me I abandoned him. I leaned forward. I did what I had to do to keep a roof over his head. Augustina, something you've never had to worry about. You have never had to choose between being a present mother and feeding your child. So do not sit there and preach to me about sacrifice from a pedestal bought with someone else's money. Augustina's mouth opened, then closed. She turned a bright shade of red. She looked at Zachary, demanding he silence me. Zachary, she hissed, are you going to let her speak to me like that in our own home? All eyes turned to my son. The ball was in his court. I had spoken my truth. The question was, did he still have enough of the boy I raised in him to recognize it? I waited for Zachary to defend me. I waited for him to slam his hand on the table and tell his wife that she had crossed a line. But he didn't. He just signaled the waiter, or rather, the hired catering staff Augustina had insisted on for cleanup, to refill the wine glasses. Seeing that she had successfully silenced both her husband and her mother-in-law, Augustina relaxed. In fact, she seemed to bloom. She sat back in her chair, swirling her glass of expensive Pinot Noir, and turned her attention to the other guests. There were 2 other couples there, friends of theirs from the club. They looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, but Augustina didn't notice. Or maybe she just didn't care. She took a long sip of wine. Her lips stained slightly purple and started to lecture. That is the only word for it. She wasn't having a conversation. She was holding court. It is all about presence, she said, waving her hand in the air. I read this article the other day about how damaging it is when parents aren't emotionally available. That is why I make sure Lorinda knows I am always here. I am her anchor. She smiled at the guests, expecting applause. I don't believe in nannies raising my child. I believe a mother should be the first face a child sees in the morning and the last one at night. Don't you agree, Linda? The woman named Linda nodded quickly, terrified to disagree. Oh, absolutely, Augustina. You're very dedicated. I sat there, gripping my napkin, listening to this performance. It was a beautiful speech. If you didn't know any better, you would think Augustina was the mother of the year. But I wasn't listening to her words anymore. I was looking at the anchor's daughter. I turned my head slightly to look at Lorinda. The poor child had barely moved since the argument began. She was sitting with her shoulders hunched forward, trying to make herself as small as possible. It is a posture I recognize. It is the posture of a child who is trying to be invisible, because being seen means being criticized. I looked closer. My eyes aren't what they used to be, but I can still spot a loose thread from a yard away. And what I saw made my stomach turn. Lorinda was wearing a beautiful dress. It was velvet, a deep navy blue, with a white lace collar. It probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. But when she shifted in her chair, I saw the back of the sleeve. There was a stain there, dried orange juice, or maybe paint. That looked days old. And the white lace collar, it was gray around the neck, wrinkled, and unirond. Augustina was so obsessed with the aesthetic of her home, so obsessed with the dust on my quilt, yet her own daughter was wearing dirty clothes. Then I looked at Lorinda's face. She wasn't just quiet. She looked exhausted. She had dark circles under her eyes that no 10-year-old should have. Her hair, which used to be thick and shiny, looked limp. She looked thin. Not healthy thin, but frail. Like a strong wind could blow her over. She caught me staring at her. For a split second, her eyes locked with mine. I didn't see the love of a doting daughter looking at her anchor. I saw fear. And beneath the fear, I saw a plea. She looked at me the way a drowning person looks at a life raft. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but then she shot a terrified glance at her mother and looked back down at her plate. A cold chill went down my spine. Augustina was still talking, her voice getting louder with every sip of wine. You have to sacrifice, she was saying. You have to give up your own selfish desires to raise a good human. That is what Nanette never understood. And then it hit me so hard I almost gasped. Projection. I had read about it in a magazine once. It is when someone accuses you of the very thing they are guilty of doing themselves. Augustina wasn't angry at me because I worked at a factory 30 years ago. She wasn't angry about the dust on the quilt. She was angry because every time she looked at me, she saw what a real mother looked like, and it reminded her of what she wasn't. She was screaming about abandonment because she was the one abandoning that little girl. Not by going to work to put food on the table, but by ignoring her while she sat right next to her. She was emotionally starving that child while preaching about nourishment. I looked at Lorinda's plate. She had pushed her peas into a pile. She hadn't touched the roast beef. She looked hungry, but hesitant, as if eating was a test she was afraid to fail. My mothering instinct kicked in. I couldn't stop it. I didn't care about the tension. I didn't care about the guests. I just wanted to feed my granddaughter. I reached for the bread basket in the center of the table. I picked out a soft, warm dinner roll, freshly baked, smelling of yeast and butter. "Here, honey," I said softly, leaning over to place the roll on Lorinda's side plate. "You haven't eaten a thing. Try this. It's warm." Lorinda's eyes lit up for a second. Her hand started to reach for the bread. She looked like a starving bird spotting a crumb. "Don't touch that." The snap of Augustina's voice was like a whip crack. Lorinda's hand jerked back as if the bread were made of fire. She shrank back into her chair, trembling. Augustina glared at me across the table. Her face was twisted in an ugly sneer. "What do you think you are doing?" she demanded. "She's hungry, Augustina," I said, holding my ground. "It's just a bread roll. Let the child eat. She is on a strict diet." Augustina snapped. She reached over and snatched the roll off Lorinda's plate, tossing it back into the basket with a look of disgust. "We don't do processed carbs. It makes them sluggish. It fogs the brain. She is 10 years old," I said, my voice rising. "She needs energy. She looks thin, Augustina. Too thin." "She is lean," Augustina corrected, her voice dripping with venom. "She is athletic. Not that you would know anything about health. I see the way you cook. Butter, cream, flour. It's poison." She turned to her guests, rolling her eyes. "This is what I have to deal with. I spend all day curating a nutrient-dense lifestyle for my daughter, and her grandmother tries to sabotage it with carb-loaded trash. You're trying to ruin her health like you ruined Zachary's childhood." The room went silent again. "Ruin Zachary's childhood?" I repeated slowly. "Yes," she hissed, "filling him with cheap, fatty food because it was easy, making him soft. I am not making the same mistakes with Lorinda. She will thank me later." I looked at Lorinda. She wasn't going to thank anyone. She was staring at that basket of bread with a hunger that broke my heart. And then I noticed Zachary. He was cutting his meat, sawing away at it, pretending he couldn't hear his wife starving his daughter. "Augustina," I said, and my voice was very quiet now. "There is a difference between a diet and control. And there is a difference between raising a child and breaking one." Augustina slammed her wine glass down. Wine sloshed over the rim, staining the white tablecloth red. "I have had enough of your judgment," she shouted. "You, who left your son alone. You, who were never there. You have no right to speak to me about how I raise my daughter." She was shouting, but I wasn't listening to the volume. I was listening to the lie. She was desperate to make me the villain, because if I was the villain, no one would notice that she was the monster. But she had made a mistake. She had pushed too hard. She had taken the food out of a hungry child's mouth in front of her grandmother. And as I watched Lorinda wipe a silent tear from her cheek, I knew that the silence at this table was about to be broken. Not by me, but by the only other person in the room who knew exactly what kind of mother Augustina really was. The sound of Augustina shouting hung in the air like smoke after a fire. The wine she had spilled was slowly soaking into the white tablecloth, spreading like a fresh wound. I looked at my son. Zachary was staring at the red stain. His face was pale. He looked like a man who wanted to be anywhere else in the world, maybe even back in that small, drafty apartment we lived in when he was 7, just so he wouldn't have to be here in this mansion with this woman. He finally looked up. His eyes were pleading. He didn't look at me. He looked at his wife. "Augustina, please," he said. His voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper. "It's Mother's Day. Can we just drop it? Please." It was a weak attempt. It wasn't the defense I had hoped for. He wasn't standing up for me. He was just begging for the noise to stop. He was begging for peace. But peace was not what Augustina wanted. She wanted dominance. She turned her head slowly to look at him, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Drop it," she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You want me to drop it?" She laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "That is your problem, Zachary. You always want to drop it. You always want to sweep everything under the rug. It must be genetic. You get that from her." She jabbed a finger in my direction without even looking at me. "I am trying to protect our daughter," Augustina said, her voice rising again. "I am trying to raise her with standards, something you wouldn't understand because you were raised with none." Zachary flinched. "Augustina, don't start this." "Don't start what?" she snapped. "The truth? Look at you, Zachary. Look at how you sit there, terrified of conflict. It's pathetic. It's exactly how she raised you. To be quiet, to be grateful for scraps, to be a peasant." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of the husbands cleared his throat and looked at his watch, clearly wondering how soon they could politely leave. But Augustina was on a roll now. She wasn't just attacking my parenting anymore. She was attacking our blood. "I picked you up out of the gutter, Zachary," she said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "When I met you, you were wearing cheap suits and driving a car that broke down every other week. I introduced you to culture. I introduced you to society. I gave you this life." She gestured wildly around the room at the crystal chandelier, the marble floors, the expensive art on the walls. "And yet," she sneered, looking back at me, "you still let her come in here and pollute my home with her tackiness, with her quilts and her carbs and her working class values. It's embarrassing, Zachary. It is frankly embarrassing to have to explain your family to my friends." My heart hammered in my chest, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering anger. She was calling us trash. She was calling the life I built with my own 2 hands the gutter. I looked at Zachary. He was looking down at his lap, his shoulders hunched. He was taking it. He was letting her strip him of his dignity right in front of his mother and his daughter. He was letting her rewrite his history as something shameful instead of something proud. I realized then that I had lost him. Not to abandonment like she claimed, but to this. He had traded his spine for a comfortable life, and now he was paying the price. But I wasn't him. I hadn't traded anything. I pushed my chair back. The legs of the chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The sound cut through Augustina's tirade. She stopped talking and looked at me, surprised. I stood up. My knees popped a little. They always do when it rains. But I stood tall. I smoothed down the front of my dress. I didn't look at Zachary. I didn't look at the guests. I looked straight ahead. I walked around the table. My steps were slow and measured. I walked past Augustina, who watched me with a confused look on her face. She expected me to shout. She expected me to cry or to storm out the front door. I didn't do any of that. I walked over to the corner of the room near the buffet table where she had thrown the box. The quilt was still lying there on the floor, half in the box, half out, looking discarded and unloved. I knelt down. It wasn't easy to get down there at my age, but I did it. I reached out and touched the fabric. I felt the stitching I had done by hand. I felt the texture of the cotton. It was clean. It was warm. It was made with love. I picked it up. I stood back up, holding the heavy quilt in my arms. The room was silent. Everyone was watching me. Even Lorinda had stopped shrinking and was watching her grandmother with wide eyes. I shook the quilt out just once to straighten it. Then, very calmly, I began to fold it, corner to corner, edge to edge. I took my time. I treated that quilt with the respect it deserved, even if no one else in the room would. I folded it into a neat square. I tucked the loose end in. I held it against my chest, like a shield. Then I turned to face Augustina. She was still standing there, glass in hand, looking like a queen who couldn't understand why the servant wasn't bowing. "Are you done?" she asked, rolling her eyes. "Are you finally leaving?" "I am leaving," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of that room. "I will not stay where I am not wanted, and I will not stay where my son is treated like a dog." Zachary looked up sharply. "But before I go," I continued, taking a step toward her, "I want you to know something, Augustina." I looked her up and down. I looked at her expensive dress, her perfect hair, and the cruelty etched into her face. "You can insult my money," I said. "You can call it small. You can insult my home. You can call it simple. You can even insult my background. I am not ashamed of working for a living. I am not ashamed of where I come from." I took another step closer. "But be very careful when you lie about my love for my family," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "And be very careful about the lies you tell yourself." Augustina scoffed. "Is that a threat? What are you going to do, Nanette? Knit me a sweater?" I didn't smile. I didn't blink. I looked past her, directly at the smart home speaker sitting on the counter behind her, the one with the little green light that had been pulsing softly the entire time. Then I looked at Lorinda, who was clutching her phone under the table. I looked back at Augustina. "It's not a threat, dear," I said softly. "It is a fact. You think you are the queen of this castle, and that you can say whatever you want, treat people however you want, and no one will ever know." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. "But you are wrong. You have been so busy shouting, you forgot to look around. You forgot that houses like this have eyes. And more importantly," I tapped the side of my ear, "the walls have ears, Augustina, and they have been listening to every single word you said tonight." Augustina's face went pale. The smirk dropped from her lips. She looked around the room, suddenly paranoid, suddenly realizing that her performance might have had a bigger audience than she intended. I turned my back on her. I walked over to Lorinda, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, "Be brave." Then, clutching my quilt, I walked out the front door and into the rain, leaving the door wide open behind me. I didn't go far. I couldn't. I stood there on the front porch, protected from the rain by the overhang, clutching that quilt to my chest like it was a life preserver. I had left the front door wide open behind me. I wanted the cold, damp air to blow into that perfect, sterile house. I wanted the wind to unsettle them. But mostly I left it open because I couldn't bear to leave my granddaughter alone in there. I heard Augustina's heels click on the hardwood floor as she walked toward the door, probably intending to slam it shut and lock me out of their lives forever. But she stopped. I could hear her laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was that sharp, cruel sound she made when she thought she had won. "Drama queen," she scoffed, loud enough for me to hear. "Did you hear her? The walls have ears. She's losing her mind." It's sad, really. I heard Zachary murmur something, but it was too low to catch. "Oh, stop it, Zachary," Augustina snapped. "She is trying to manipulate you. She is trying to make me look like the bad guy, because I have standards." Who does she think she is? Who does she think is going to stop me? You. She let out a short, dismissive breath. You won't stop me. You never do. You know who butters your bread? Zachary. My heart sank. She was right. He hadn't stopped her. He had sat there and let her insult his mother and his history. I am the mother here, Augustina announced to the room, her voice reclaiming its authority. And I say we are done with this nonsense. Lorinda, sit up straight. Stop crying. You are embarrassing yourself. For a second, there was silence. I expected to hear Lorinda sniffle and obey. I expected to hear the scrape of her chair as she pulled herself back to the table, shrinking back into the invisible box her mother had built for her. But that's not what happened. Instead, I heard a chair fly back. It hit the floor with a loud wooden crash that echoed out into the street. No, the scream was so loud, so raw, that I jumped. It didn't sound like my shy, quiet Lorinda. It sounded like a wild animal that had finally chewed through its cage. Lorinda! Augustina shouted, shocked. What has gotten into you? Stop it! Lorinda screamed again. Her voice was shaking, cracking under the weight of tears she had been holding back for years. Stop lying! Stop lying about Grandma! I leaned closer to the open door, my heart pounding in my throat. I could see them through the sliver of the opening. Lorinda was standing up, her small hands balled into fists at her sides, her face red and wet with tears. She wasn't looking at the floor anymore. She was looking straight at her mother. Sit down, Augustina hissed, her voice low and dangerous. You are making a scene. I don't care. Lorinda yelled. You called Grandma a bad mom. You said she abandoned Dad. But that's not true. Grandma never abandoned us. It was you. The air left the room. You could feel it. The guests, who had been awkwardly sipping their wine, froze completely. Augustina took a step back, looking at her daughter like she was a stranger. How dare you? She whispered. I am your mother. I am here every day. No, you're not. Lorinda sobbed. You're here, but you're not here. You're always on your phone. You're always in your room with the door locked. You tell me to go away because you have a headache. You tell the nanny to deal with me. I manage this household. Augustina sputtered, her face turning pale. I coordinate. You miss my play. Lorinda cut her off, the words tumbling out in a rush of pain. Last month. The spring play. You promised you would come. You said you would be in the front row. I looked for you. Every time the curtain opened, I looked for you. Augustina opened her mouth to speak, but Lorinda didn't let her. You weren't there, she cried. You were at the spa with your friends. I saw the pictures on your phone. You lied and said you had a migraine, but you were getting a facial. Lorinda, that is enough. Grandma came. Lorinda shouted, pointing a trembling finger toward the door where I was standing. Grandma took the bus. She sat in the front row. She brought me flowers. She's the one who made my costume, because you said buying one was easier, but the store-bought one scratched my neck. Grandma sewed it for me. I felt a tear slide down my own cheek. I didn't know she knew I had taken the bus. I didn't know she had seen me in the front row. I thought she was too busy focusing on her lines. But children see everything. They see who shows up. You say Grandma abandoned her kid. Lorinda's voice dropped to a whisper, but it was heavy with accusation. Grandma is the only one who acts like a mom. You just act like a boss. You're the one who isn't a mom. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the awkward silence of a dinner party gone wrong. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of the truth. Augustina stood there, her mouth slightly open. Her narrative had been cut to ribbons. She couldn't blame this on me. She couldn't blame this on working-class values. This was her own child, her anchor, exposing her neglect In front of everyone she tried to impress. She looked around the room, desperate for an ally. She looked at Linda. Linda looked down at her lap. She looked at the other husbands. They were studying the ceiling. So she turned to the only person she thought she could still bully. Zachary, she said, her voice shrill. Are you going to let her talk to me like that? She is hysterical. She needs to be medicated. Look at her. She's out of control. Zachary slowly stood up. I held my breath. He looked at his daughter. He saw the stained sleeve of her expensive dress. He saw the red, puffy eyes. He saw the desperation in her face, the desperation of a little girl who just wanted to be loved, not managed. Then he looked at his wife. For the first time in a long time, I saw the fog clear from my son's eyes. He had been working 80 hours a week to pay for this house. He had been working himself into an early grave to pay for the nannies, the private schools, the club memberships, all to keep Augustina happy. He thought he was providing for his family. But in that moment, looking at his weeping child, he realized he hadn't been providing for them. He had been funding their neglect. He had been paying for Augustina to live a life of leisure while his mother took the bus to see his daughters play. He had been blind. He had believed Augustina's constant complaints that she was overwhelmed and busy. He had believed her when she said I was a bad influence. He had believed it all because it was easier than facing the truth that he had married a woman who loved the lifestyle. He provided more than the child they had created. Zachary didn't shout. He didn't flip the table. He just looked at Augustina with a look of absolute, crushing clarity. She's not hysterical, Augustina, Zachary said. His voice was flat, devoid of the fear that was usually there. She's honest. Honest, Augustina shrieked. She is an ungrateful brat. After everything I do. What do you do? Zachary asked. It wasn't a rhetorical question. He asked it simply. What did you do today? Besides yell at my mother and ignore our daughter? I hosted this dinner, she yelled. You ordered catering, Zachary corrected her. And you insulted the only person who actually made something with her hands. He walked over to Lorinda. He knelt down, ignoring the creak of his suit trousers, and wrapped his arms around her. Lorinda collapsed into his shoulder, sobbing. He held her tight, stroking her hair, rocking her back and forth. Augustina watched them, her face twisting into a mask of fury. She was losing control, and she knew it. Get up, Zachary, she commanded. Stop coddling her. This is exactly what your mother does. You are making her weak. Zachary stood up, lifting Lorinda into his arms as if she were still a toddler. He turned to face his wife. My mother, he said, his voice hard as steel, raised a man who knows the difference between a parent and a roommate. And right now, Augustina, you are looking a lot like a bad roommate. He started walking toward the door. Toward me. Where do you think you are going? Augustina screamed, chasing after him. You can't leave. We have guests. Zachary. Zachary didn't stop. He walked right out the front door, stepping onto the porch where I was standing. He saw me there, clutching the quilt. His eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered. I'm so sorry. It's okay, I said, reaching out to touch his arm. I'm here. I know, he said. You've always been here. He looked back into the house, where Augustina was standing in the hallway, fuming. We're leaving, Zachary called out to her. Don't wait up. And then the most incredible thing happened. He didn't just walk to his car. He turned to me. Mom, he said, can we come to your place? I think Lorinda could use some of that pot roast. And I think I need to see that quilt. Augustina stood in the doorway, watching her perfect life walk away into the rain. She opened her mouth to scream something else, to throw another insult, to fire another weapon. But she had no weapons left. Her daughter had taken them all away. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. We were halfway down the driveway, the rain soaking into my Sunday clothes, when the front door flew open again. Augustina wasn't going to let us leave. People like her never do. They can't stand the idea of someone walking away from them. They need to have the last word. They need to win. You can't take her. Augustina screamed, running out onto the porch in her expensive heels. She slipped a little on the wet stone, but caught herself on the railing. That is kidnapping. I will call the police. Zachary, I will call the police on your mother. Zachary stopped walking. He turned around slowly, shielding Lorinda's head from the rain with his hand. He looked at his wife, not with anger, but with a kind of deep, exhausting pity. Go ahead, Zachary said calmly. Call them. And when they get here, Lorinda can tell them exactly why she doesn't want to be in the same house as you right now. Augustina froze. She knew she couldn't risk that. A police report would ruin her reputation at the club. It would ruin the perfect image she had crafted so carefully on social media. This is ridiculous. She spat, crossing her arms over her chest, trying to shield herself from the cold. You are believing the lies of a senile old woman and a confused child. I am a good mother. I sacrifice my life for this family. That word again. Sacrifice. Something inside me finally snapped. I had promised myself I wouldn't interfere. I had promised myself I would let Zachary handle his own marriage. I didn't want to be the stereotypical mother-in-law causing trouble. But she was standing there, lying to my son's face, while my granddaughter trembled in his arms. You don't know the meaning of that word, I said. I let go of Zachary's arm and took a step back toward the porch. I reached into my purse, my old, worn leather purse that Augustina had made fun of when I arrived. I pulled out a small black pocket diary. It was just a cheap thing I bought at the drugstore for $1, but what was written inside was worth more than everything in her house. What is that? Augustina sneered. Your grocery list? No, I said, flipping it open. It's a log. I looked at Zachary. I never told you this, son, because I didn't want to break your heart. I didn't want you to think you had made a mistake with your marriage. I thought if I just helped out quietly, things would get better. But they didn't. I looked down at the pages, my handwriting shaky, but legible. March 12th, I read aloud. Lorinda called me at 4:30 p.m. She was crying because she was locked out of the house. You were supposed to be home, Augustina. You told Zachary you were managing the household. But Lorinda was sitting on the back step in the cold. Augustina's face went white. I was at the grocery store. Traffic was bad. I wrote down what you posted on Facebook that day. I continued, ignoring her. Check in at the Sanctuary Spa at 4:15 p.m. Caption, much needed self-care. Zachary looked at his wife sharply. I flipped the page. April 4th, Zachary was out of town on business. You called me, Augustina, and said you had a migraine and couldn't pick Lorinda up from piano lessons. I took the bus across town. When I got there, the teacher told me Lorinda had been waiting for an hour. And when I dropped her off at home, I saw your car pulling in. You were wearing tennis whites. No migraine. Just a match with the girls. Stop it, Augustina shrieked. You're stalking me. Zachary, she's crazy. May 2nd, I read, my voice getting stronger. Lorinda called me whispering. She said she was hungry. It was 8 p.m. You had a dinner party for your book club. You told the guests Lorinda had already eaten. But she hadn't. She was in her room with nothing. I had a pizza delivered to the side window. I closed the book with a snap. I have dates, Zachary. I have times. I have receipts for food, for clothes, for school supplies that Augustina said she bought, but never did. I kept it all. Not because I wanted to hurt you, but because I knew one day she would try to say I was the one who didn't care. I looked at Augustina. She looked like a cornered animal. All the bluster, all the arrogance, it was draining out of her, replaced by fear. She knew she had been caught. I didn't speak up because I wanted to keep the peace. I told her, "But you broke the peace today when you came for my son, and you definitely broke it when you hurt this child." Zachary stared at me. He looked at the little black book in my hand. Then he looked at the quilt I was holding against my chest. "Let me see it, Mom," he said softly. He wasn't talking about the book. He was talking about the quilt. I handed it to him. He shifted Lorinda to his hip and took the quilt with his free hand. He ran his thumb over the stitching. He looked at the floral patterns, the vines, the golden thread of his daughter's initials. He saw the hours. He saw the patience. He saw the love that had been stitched into every single inch of that fabric. Then he looked at the dust Augustina had complained about. There was no dust. It was perfect. He looked up at his wife. The look in his eyes was terrifying. It wasn't hot anger. It was cold, absolute finality. It was the look of a man who suddenly realizes he has been sleeping next to a stranger. "You called this cheap," Zachary said, holding up the quilt. It's just a blanket." "Zachary," Augustina stammered, trying to regain her footing. "It doesn't match our decor. I was just being honest." "My mother worked 3 jobs," Zachary said. His voice was low, but it cut through the rain like a razor. "She worked 3 jobs, standing on concrete floors for 12 hours a day, so I could have a life, so I could go to college, so I could buy a house like this." He took a step toward the porch. "She scrubbed floors. She missed meals. She wore the same winter coat for 10 years, so I could have a new one. That is what a mother does, Augustina. She gives." He gestured to the house, to the cars, to the clothes Augustina was wearing. "You don't work at all?" he said. "You have never worked a day in your life. I pay for the house. I pay for the cars. I pay for the food you won't let our daughter eat. And you can't even sit through a single dinner for my mother without spitting on her." "Zachary, please," Augustina said, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I was stressed. Let's just go inside and talk." "No," Zachary said. He turned his back on her, looking at the wet pavement of the driveway. He took a deep breath, and when he exhaled, it looked like a heavy weight was leaving his body. "I want you out," he said. Augustina blinked. "What?" "I want you out of my house," Zachary said, turning back to face her one last time. "Tonight. I'm taking Lorinda to Mom's place. When we come back tomorrow to get her things, I want you gone." "You can't do that," she screamed. "This is my house, too. Check the deed." "Augustina," Zachary said coldly, "and check the prenup you were so offended by, but signed anyway. This is my house, and I am done letting you poison it." He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned to me. "Come on, Mom," he said gently. "Let's go home." He opened the car door for me. I got in, clutching my black book. He buckled Lorinda into the back seat, covering her with the quilt, the cheap quilt that was now keeping his daughter warm. As we backed out of the driveway, I looked out the window. Augustina was standing on the porch, alone in the massive, empty house, screaming at the rain. She looked very small. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel angry. I just felt relief. The truth had finally spoken, and it had spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. The drive to my house was quiet. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the dinner party. It was the peaceful silence of a storm that has finally passed. Lorinda had fallen asleep in the back seat before we even hit the highway, clutching that quilt up to her chin. She was safe. When we pulled into my driveway, the rain had stopped. My little house isn't much to look at compared to the mansion we had just left. The paint is peeling a bit on the trim, and the garden is overgrown with hydrangeas, not manicured hedges. but as Zachary turned off the engine, I saw him take a deep breath. He looked at the porch light, glowing yellow in the dark. "It looks the same," he said quietly. "It is the same," I told him. "Home doesn't change just because you leave it." We carried Lorinda inside and tucked her into the spare bedroom, Zachary's old room. I heated up the pot roast I had left in the slow cooker for my own dinner, knowing deep down they might need it. While Lorinda slept, Zachary sat at my small, round kitchen table. The linoleum floor is scratched, and the chairs don't match, but he sat there looking more comfortable than he had in that expensive Italian leather dining chair an hour ago. His phone buzzed on the table. It buzzed again, and again. He looked at the screen, and a grim smile touched his lips. "It's Linda," he said, "Augustina's friend from the club." "What does she say?" I asked, pouring him a cup of black coffee. "Apparently, the party ended abruptly," Zachary said, reading the text. "After we drove off, Augustina tried to rally the troops. She went back into the dining room and told everyone that I was having a mental breakdown. She told them I was abusive and that you had brainwashed Lorinda." I shook my head. "She doesn't know when to stop." "She told them she was going to sue me for kidnapping." Zachary continued reading. "But Linda says nobody bought it. She says the room was dead silent. Then, one by one, the guests just stood up and left. Linda said her husband told Augustina, 'You should be worrying less about your reputation and more about why your daughter is terrified of you.' They turned their backs on her mom. She's alone in that big house. She will threaten legal action. I warned him. She won't go down quietly." "Let her try," Zachary said, setting the phone down face first. "I have the receipts now. Thanks to you." He wrapped his hands around the warm mug of coffee and stared into the dark liquid. The anger that had fueled him in the driveway was fading, replaced by a deep, crushing shame. I watched his shoulders slump. He looked like the little boy who used to come home with a scraped knee, afraid I would be mad at him for ruining his pants. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. His voice cracked. I sat down opposite him. "You already said that, Zachary." "No, I'm really sorry," he said, looking up at me. His eyes were red. "I let her drive a wedge between us. For years, I let her talk about you like you were some embarrassment, and I didn't say anything." He wiped a hand over his face. "She made me feel like where we came from wasn't enough," he admitted. "She made me feel like growing up in this house with a mom who worked in a factory. She made me feel like it was something to hide, like it was low class. So I tried to be what she wanted. I tried to buy the right clothes, the right house, the right friends. I thought if I just worked hard enough, I could scrub the poor off of me." "Oh, Zachary," I sighed. I was ashamed. He choked out, the tears finally spilling over. I was ashamed of my own roots because I wanted to please a woman who despises them. And because of that, I left you alone. I left you to take the bus to my daughter's play. I left you to feed her pizza through a window." He put his head in his hands and wept. It was a raw, ugly sound, the sound of a man realizing he had almost sold his soul for a lie. "I'm a bad son," he sobbed. "I'm a bad son." I didn't say a word. I just stood up and walked around the table. I pulled his head against my stomach, just like I used to when he was small. I ran my fingers through his hair, which was starting to gray at the temples. "You are not a bad son," I told him firmly. "You are a lost son who found his way back." He wrapped his arms around my waist and held on tight. "I don't deserve you," he mumbled into my apron. "After everything I let her say to you, how can you just sit here and feed me? How can you not hate me?" I pulled back and lifted his chin, so he had to look at me. I needed him to see the truth in my eyes. "Listen to me, Zachary," I said. "Mothers don't keep score." He blinked, tears catching in his lashes. We don't keep a ledger of who called, who, I said. We don't tally up the missed birthdays or the harsh words. We don't hold grudges. That is what wives like Augustina do. But a mother? I forgave you the moment you were born, Zachary. Before you even made a mistake, I had already decided to love you through it. But I hurt you, he said. Yes, you did. I nodded. And it stung. But pain is part of the job description. The only thing that matters to me is that you are here now. You woke up. You stood up for your daughter. And you came home. I kissed his forehead. You can't buy class, Zachary. I whispered. And you can't buy love. Augustina has a lot of money, but she is the poorest woman I know. You are rich. You have a daughter who loves you, and you have a mother who is never going to close her door on you. Don't ever be ashamed of this house again. This house was built on love, and that is stronger than any marble floor. Zachary took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. He wiped his eyes and sat up straighter. You're right, he said. I'm done hiding, and I'm done apologizing to her. Good, I said, patting his shoulder. Now eat your pot roast. You're going to need your strength. Tomorrow, we have a lot of work to do. He picked up his fork and took a bite. He closed his eyes and smiled, a real, genuine smile. Tastes like home, he said, and for the first time in years, I knew he really meant it. The fallout was messy, and the road. It has been 6 months since that rainy afternoon in May. The leaves in Seattle have turned from green to gold, and the air has that crisp chill that tells you winter is coming. But for the first time in years, I don't feel the cold. Things look very different now. Zachary didn't go back to the mansion. He went back once with a moving truck and a lawyer to get their things. He told me Augustina stood in the marble foyer screaming about how he was making a mistake, how he would never survive without her connections and her social status. She kept the big house. She kept the expensive furniture. She kept the aesthetic she loved so much. But she is the only one living in it. Zachary and Lorinda moved into a nice, modest rental house about 10 minutes down the road from me. It doesn't have a chandelier, and the floors aren't imported marble. But it has something that the mansion never had. It has laughter. I went over there yesterday to help Lorinda with her homework. She is a different child. The dark circles under her eyes are gone. She has put on a little weight, healthy weight. She runs to the door when I knock. She doesn't shrink away from food anymore. In fact, she asked me to teach her how to make my scalloped potatoes. We were sitting in her bedroom, and the first thing I noticed wasn't her toys or her books. It was her bed. Spread out perfectly across the mattress was my quilt. It wasn't hidden in a closet. It wasn't thrown on the floor. It was right there, the centerpiece of her room. She told me she sleeps under it every single night because it makes her feel safe. She traced the golden thread of her initials with her finger and told me it feels like a hug, Grandma. That is all I ever wanted. Zachary is different, too. He looks 10 years younger. He stopped working those 80-hour weeks. He realized he doesn't need to fund a lifestyle he never actually wanted. He comes over for dinner every Sunday, and he doesn't check his phone once. He listens. He laughs. He is present. Augustina still tries to stir up trouble now, and then she posts things online about betrayal and toxic in-laws trying to get sympathy from strangers. But nobody pays much attention to her anymore. The friends who turned their backs on her that night never came back. It turns out, when you build a life on appearances, you end up with very few real friends when the curtain falls. I don't hate her. Truly, I don't. I just feel sorry for her. She had everything: a loving husband, a beautiful daughter, a devoted mother-in-law, and she threw it all away because she was too busy looking in the mirror. She wanted to be called a mom without doing the work And now she has the title, but she doesn't have the child. I sit on my porch sometimes drinking my tea, and I think about that moment when I folded the quilt. I think about how close I came to walking away and letting her win. But I stayed. I stood my ground. I learned something important that day. I learned that truth doesn't always need to shout to be heard. Augustina shouted. She screamed. She tried to drown us out with noise and insults. But the truth just sat there, quietly waiting for its moment. Sometimes you just have to wait. You have to trust that the seeds of love you planted, the double shifts, the bus rides, the delivered pizzas, will eventually bloom. And when they do, no amount of lies can cover them up. I look at my family now, healed and happy, and I know that the legacy I'm leaving behind isn't money. It's not a big house. It's that quilt. It's the knowledge that when the storm came, I didn't abandon them. I wrapped them up in warmth, and I brought them home. Have you ever had to wait for the truth to come out? Have you ever been misunderstood, only to be vindicated in the end? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Did you like the story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story.